Okay, so in order to go into the year 1500, one of the things that we have to understand is, right off the bat, Europe was not the center of world power the way it is today in the year 1500. Back then, Europe was basically scientifically, economically, and militarily backward. They had been overpowered by another group called the Ottoman Empire, which is just the newest of the Muslim empires that emerged in mostly the 1300s. Let's see. There we go. And for each lecture, I have this kind of title page that gives the kind of title of what we're doing in a period of years. And I break up the slides into groups, so into sections. So in order to understand the dominant empire of the world, and was even invading Europe by the 1500s, we have to understand the long-term history of the Islamic government. Yeah?
What's CE?
What's what?
CE.
Oh, CE is Common Era. So you guys are familiar with BC and AD, those terms? Historians try to avoid using those terms for the most part because they're too tied to one religious interpretation, right? Christianity. So historians that claim to be more objective and more scientific, they use terms for before zero. They call it BCE, before Common Era, and then after zero, CE, Common Era. Does that make sense? So it's the same year zero that is used. So BC turns into BCE and AD turns into CE. Does that make sense? Okay. So you'll often see the term CE instead of AD in textbooks and lectures and whatnot. But to understand the rise of the Ottoman Empire, which is the dominant Muslim empire going into the year 1500, we're going to reach all the way back into the 700s and give a very brief history of different governments. The first one actually emerged in the mid-600s, but we'll skip past them just because of time constraints. So the Abbasid state came into power basically through a revolution against the former government. And the Abbasids were just one part of the revolution. There are many, many different groups that took part in this revolution, mostly in areas here from eastern Persia, all the way down to the Arabian Peninsula and across North Africa and into what is today Spain and Portugal. So that was the old government, and each of these regions rose up in revolution from about 747. And finally, the government gave out. The government was toppled, and this new government come into existence called the Abbasids. They moved the capital city from Damascus to Baghdad for several reasons. Number one, they wanted to build a whole new government, and they were afraid that the people in Damascus had too much affiliation with the old government. So they moved it to Baghdad, but Baghdad also becomes central because the Abbasids are much more interested in kind of inter-regional trade. And Baghdad sits right at the entry point from North Africa and Europe going toward Persia. You basically cross through that area to get to ancient Persia, or what was ancient Persia, and go all the way to India and China. Does that make sense? So it was a center of inter-regional trade, and that's how the Abbasids not just portrayed themselves, but became very interested in politically. Baghdad at the time was already a town. It was a city. It was a fairly small city. There's a couple, maybe 20,000 inhabitants or so. But when they moved the government to Baghdad, Baghdad absolutely explodes. At its height, it had somewhere around 500,000 people living in it. So it's at least 10 times larger than it ever was before. At the same time, the big European city, Constantinople, had maybe 200,000 people in it. So Baghdad, within a few decades, transforms itself to being one of the largest groupings of people on the whole planet for its time, if not the largest. The city is also surrounded by huge amounts of fertile land, which is useful because if you get a bunch of people together, you have to feed them. So you have to have a lot of farms out in the countryside to grow enough food to keep this population alive. The Abbasids, for the most part, were interested in international commerce, trade, buying and selling things across borders. And when they permit large trading companies to exist in their holdings, in their territory, those companies start going off and exploring places that a lot of people from this area had never been, especially going into Central and East Asia. And whenever you get traders going to new places, they make contact with people they've never really talked to before. And when you have two isolated communities in two cultures, one of the major problems and powers of culture is that if you just grow up in one culture, you never talk to anyone from another culture, then you tend to think that your own culture is exactly how everyone in the world exists, right? Does that make sense? From just social norms like dating or marriage or land ownership or what kind of clothes you wear if you're rich or something like this, what kind of house you should own. Those are not rules set in stone, but they're usually just kind of social expectations. And if you stay within your own cultural bubble and you never meet someone from another place that has other cultural ideas, you come to think that the way your culture does things is just the way all humans do things, and that's usually false. And one of the ways that you pop that bubble is to go talk to other people. And that's what really gets launched with these commercial explorations and these trading companies that go to new parts of the world that a lot of Muslims had not been to yet. They start making contact with people that have other cultural ideas. And what happens if you meet someone that has a whole different definition of what marriage should be or what dating is like? You talk to them, or you just ignore them. I guess that's another option. But usually you talk to them, you try to understand, and you exchange information like, this is how we do things here, how do you do that, where you're from? And you get basically a kind of philosophical exchange. You get an exchange of different ideas. And oftentimes when cultures start kind of merging together, you get an intellectual explosion because people start questioning not just what other cultures are doing, but what they've been doing within their own culture. Does that make sense? So a lot of new questions start being asked that sometimes haven't been asked for even centuries. So under the Abbasid leadership, their empire undergoes a massive intellectual explosion. They get exposed to ideas from all over the world, and not only do they think about those ideas, but they actively take books from other cultures and they bring them back to Baghdad. And they create what was the greatest university system in the world, bar none at that point in time. The Baghdad University was called the House of Wisdom. And they literally traveled the whole, or at least as much of the globes they thought that existed. They went into ancient Greece, they went into China, they went into all these other places and brought back the philosophical textbooks from all these other places and stored them in the libraries of Baghdad. So several things start happening within the culture and launches it on a path of scientific innovation. Number one, the Arabic numbering system that they were using is far superior to almost any other numbering system in the world for simplicity. What kind of numbers were Europeans using at this point?
Roman numerals.
Roman numerals. Have you ever seen Roman numerals before? Like if you want to write the number 8, you have to use several characters. And if you want to do advanced mathematics, that's difficult. How do you write down an equation that says, what is 222 times 18 in Roman numerals? How do you figure that out? It's extraordinarily difficult. So the Arabic numbering system that uses one digit for each number, 0 to 9, is much more efficient and capable of doing advanced mathematics. So the Arabic numbering system, as it spread throughout the world, became dominant. And the numbers that you use today, the digits, are from that part of the world. And it took the Europeans a few more hundreds of years to adapt to it, but they eventually did. Another thing that a lot of these Muslim scholars did was literally go and study the ancient philosophers of all these different parts of the world. And one of their favorites was Aristotle from Greece. And Aristotle had long been dead for many centuries by this point. They liked Aristotle a lot because he had his hands in a whole lot of different subjects. He studied and wrote about a lot of different things. So he becomes a great hero to the Muslim scholars. And they take his writings out of Greece and they bring them to Baghdad. And they probably would have been lost, the original writings, if they hadn't been stored in the Baghdad libraries. So the Europeans at this point are in the Dark Ages. Most Europeans don't even know how to read and write their own name. And the Muslim education system centered in Baghdad is far superior. And they start getting involved in what we would today call the scientific method, observing events and trying to figure out what is the kind of driving force of those events, natural phenomena like hurricanes or floods or anything like that. What causes these things to happen objectively through research and experimentation. So they launch forward on scientific thought and innovation much, much further than the Europeans had by that point. Questions about any of this so far? Yeah.
I guess it's semi-related. I was just wondering, when do they go from being like the kind of intellectual center of the world to the kind of not that they are today?
Well, they still are one of the major centers of the world, but they've largely been surpassed by the Europeans because over a few hundreds of years, and that's one of the things we're going to focus on in this semester, the leadership of this government eventually becomes very conservative and worried about these scientific experiments.
Okay.
So you get a religious-dominated faction who think that we should be, like humans should be spending more time focusing on the relationship with God than running all these kinds of experiments and reading all these books and whatnot. And that starts happening especially in the 1700s, right at the point where the Europeans go through their own kind of scientific awakening again. So over a few hundred years, the Middle Eastern societies become kind of educationally stagnant. They don't change much, whereas the Europeans start growing and growing faster and faster. So by the 1800s, the Europeans are the scientific leaders of the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But that's something that we're going to address over and over again throughout the semester. One interesting thing, and this is why I like using this image of Aristotle, this is probably not how Aristotle actually dressed, right? So when they brought him into their educational system, made him a center point of focus in their university system, they adopted him and portrayed him as living within their own culture, which is a very common thing that a lot of cultures do. So this is just one example, but it's pretty stark. They have Aristotle dressing and teaching and living within the confines of their own cultural ideas. And it's not just Aristotle. They launch forward. They take ideas even from China, ideas on especially navigation and even weather prediction. And the two really major things that they eventually take out of China are the development of gunpowder. The Chinese were the first to create that, or to invent gunpowder. They had first used it for fireworks and very kind of low-level cannon. And eventually the Muslim governments will be the ones, especially the Ottoman government, develops the very high-powered cannon and early forms of rifles. Another thing that they took out of China was the invention of the magnetic compass. The Chinese were also the first to do that. And when Muslim traders and eventually Muslim kind of government representatives got to China, they understood how militarily valuable that could be to build up navies and sail out in the oceans, actually know where they're going, objectively. So by the 12, 13, 1400s, what we today call the Middle East, which is a modern term, was the scientific center of the world. They developed higher levels of algebra than the Europeans had at that point. Higher levels of medical practices. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. So the Europeans are scientifically and technologically backward. And they are threatened by this. Because what happens when one group invents better technology, oftentimes governments apply that to their military. They build up stronger armies. Does that make sense? Still happening today? Obviously, militaries are still experimenting with how to use technology in warfare. And usually the government that has the highest level of technology is usually the most militarily powerful on the planet. And that's been true for hundreds and hundreds of years. So moving on. Questions? No? Okay. So this is ongoing for several hundred years. And it had the massive support of the Abbasid government. But a lot of members of this society, average people out there, do not agree with what the government is supporting. They want people to not get involved in scientific studies or get involved in trading companies or something like this because they see it as a distraction from what people are supposed to do. And these are often led by very religious people who say, instead of running your business all the time and trying to get rich and buy a big house and have a very lavish lifestyle, you should instead dedicate your attention to forming a personal relationship with God, which they said was the original intent of creating Islam in the first place. That Islam was handed to humanity basically by God by picking out a certain person to walk around and spread the message of what people should be doing. So the kind of religious-minded people in the Abbasid state, and even later on, constantly argue that the focus on wealth and trade and science and philosophy, that's all distraction. It's a corruption of what God wants people to do in their daily lives. And they literally use the word corruption. They say that people in society are being led astray. And if they're not doing what God wants them to do in their daily lives, what happens to them eventually? Yeah, they go to the negative afterlife scenario. So it's not just that a lot of these religious factions wanted power for themselves, and maybe some of them did, but a lot of them are very much concerned for overall society. They want to help people save their souls. So that's a major motivation for several factions. They give public speeches, they start clubs, they walk down streets, they advertise, they try to gain more and more kind of people to join their movements. And there's many different movements. Some are even violent, trying to intimidate people into turning back to God. And some of these groups even attack some of the philosophers, and even the university professors are assassinated by religious groups who say you shouldn't be running these kinds of experiments. Does this sound familiar at all? It's still happening, even in the United States. There are some people who hate the increasing levels of technology so much that they have attacked university researchers to stop the research from being done. So it's not just, one fringe nutty group from way back then. This is still happening.
Who's the guy that's hiding out in Russia right now?
Guy hiding out in Russia.
He stole the...
That is so unrelated, it's not even funny.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it...
I don't know. I don't even know what you're talking about.
Yeah, he stole all the technology that the government was tapping people's phones.
Oh, Snowden. Yeah, that guy. Well, I don't think he's arguing against the technology. I think he's more arguing against how people are using it. Yeah. Well, technology is not good or bad in and of itself, right? It's our choice in how we use technology. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Like, nuclear research has done really great things for medical practices and research and whatnot, and diagnosing things, right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
But it's also caused some very destructive kinds of weapons. It has led to atomic bombs that have killed hundreds of thousands of people. So it's really our choice. Cell phones can be a very useful thing for you when you have useful information to make contact with people with or something like this. But let's face it, most of our lives just aren't that interesting and important. We don't have to always be on our phones. We don't have to constantly be immersed in talking with others. Right? At least that's my opinion. I mean, do you really have to share pictures of your cat all the time with all your friends as much as possible? I mean, I love my cat. She's really cool, but I don't need, everyone in the world to know about it. So it comes down to a human choice. But questions about this interpretation of corruption and where technology leads? No. Moving on. No opinion? No. You guys are afraid? When I ask questions, I usually like to have some kind of feedback. Does anyone want to move on?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Does anyone want to stay here? Ask more questions about this? Okay. Sometimes you guys scare me. Okay. The Abbasid state became corrupted. Government became too bureaucratic in a lot of ways, unresponsive to popular needs. So a series of revolutions actually hit the Abbasid state, starting even in the late 800s. Egypt broke away from the empire and became an independent country again through a kind of revolutionary battle. And the Abbasids tried to hold on to the rest of it. But piece by piece, once Egypt goes, that creates a great example that other groups can rise up and proclaim independence. So Iberia goes next, and then by 935, all areas outside of Baghdad itself are basically independent of the empire. So it, for all intents and purposes, is not an empire anymore. It still calls itself the empire, but in reality it doesn't exist. And then Baghdad itself falls in its own internal revolution in 945. So the Abbasid state only lasted somewhere, depending on what you want to think of as the powerful government, around 200 years. But that's how fast we're skipping forward on that. After the Abbasid state falls, you do not get the end of Islam or the end of the kind of debate between the pious lifestyle and the pursuit of wealth and power. It's basically just breaking down to more local levels. The empire is gone, but there's a whole bunch of independent governments. So it's what historians call fragmentation. It's like you take a big pane of glass and just drop it on the ground. It doesn't stop being glass. It just cracks into a whole bunch of different pieces. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So you have tons of different governments, and they start fighting each other over land and whatnot. Some of the eastern governments continue their invasions into northern India, which had been ongoing even during the Abbasid era. And this sows a whole lot of international hatred between northern Indians who feel justifiably that they've been invaded and conquered and victimized and occupied by Muslim armies. But this goes back and forth for a few hundred years, where Muslim groups try to invade and conquer northern India. They get a hold of a piece of it, they occupy it, but Indian revolutionary movements break out and kick the invaders out. So that's back and forth for many, many, many years. And the legacy of that continues right down to today. There are large Muslim populations in northern India today. But we'll get to all that a whole lot later. And there's an ongoing conflict between those kinds of populations, between the Indian Hindu majority and the kind of northwestern India that has a lot of Muslim people living in it. Okay. A few hundred years after the fall of the Abbasid, you have a few centuries of many different governments, sometimes cooperating, sometimes fighting, just depending on circumstances. A new one will arise in northwestern Anatolia, which is this peninsula here. This becomes known eventually as the Ottoman Empire. And this one spreads under the kingship of the first guy named Osmanli I. I'll show you his picture in a second. But he gradually just starts going to war with his neighbors, conquering more and more land, and eventually spreads to the rest of Anatolia. And down through a few hundred years, his inheritors, the people who fought him, conquer large chunks of the rest of what used to be the overall empire. And here is Osmanli the First. It was originally called the Osmanli Empire after him, but after a few centuries, the name changes. It gets bastardized down to Ottoman. So the Ottoman Empire is what you'll usually find in textbooks and more recent kind of references. And the Ottoman Empire stays around for a long time. Does anyone know how long? What ends the Ottoman Empire? Does anyone know? World War I, 1919. So 100 years ago, the Ottoman Empire was still around. But that's the first guy, the first kind of founder of the thing. But after in his lifetime, it grows and grows and grows. So here's Anatolia. And Osmanli started off in northwestern Anatolia. Through his lifetime, he led the conquest of most of the peninsula, and it grew in a couple hundred years after him. One thing that not just the Ottoman leadership wanted to do, but Muslim leaders of the empire going back hundreds and hundreds of years, they always wanted to attack Constantinople. That's the big European city. And Constantinople is a fortress. It's surrounded on three sides by water. It's a major trading post. It's one of the most important cities of all of Europe. So different Muslim leaders have been after this place for centuries. And the Bosporus and the Dardanelles are just the waterways, the kind of very slim waterways that gain access to the city between the two big chunks of land. But that's where Constantinople is. In the couple hundred years between Osmanli I going into the 1400s, the Ottoman state had expanded and even gone around Constantinople and conquered areas of Europe to the north and west of Constantinople. So you can see up until the 1400s, everything in these kind of pink and yellowish areas are taken over. Therefore, Constantinople is surrounded by enemy forces. Constantinople is seen as one of the giant European Christian cities. And it's the last giant city of the old Roman Empire. So the Europeans are very worried about the survival of this city. They view it as the last kind of defensive position to stop the Muslims from invading and conquering the rest of Europe. Does that make sense? So a lot of Europeans that are even enemies of Constantinople send reinforcements to Constantinople to attack against the Muslim armies, to keep them out of the rest of Europe. Is that clear? And this has been ongoing for, again, hundreds and hundreds of years. The leaders in Constantinople understood that when this guy comes to the throne of the Ottoman state in 1451, Mehmet II officially announces that his life goal is to conquer the city. So the leaders of the city understand that this is going to be the kind of apocalyptic battle. So the leaders at Constantinople start building up their defenses. And here's a map of the city itself. It's on a peninsula. It's surrounded by three sides by water. So the defensive idea for the city is to, number one, build a huge series of walls in the city. So if the Muslim armies attack, they'll be slowed down by the first wall. They can try to get over the first wall. It may take them a long time. Then they'll just run into another one. And if they get through that, they'll run into another one. Does that make sense? Let's see. And they're very afraid that the Muslim armies will instead put their soldiers on boats and try to land behind the wall so they won't have to attack the wall. So to stop that, the leaders of the city laid down basically spike strips across the water from one side to another to prevent the Muslim boats from going around and landing in the good ports on the kind of northern part of the city. Does that make sense? The biggest and most important spike strip is this one here. So they figured they had a very strong defensive theory. This had often proved successful because the Muslims had attacked the city before and had failed over and over and over again. The Muslim armies, though, at this point, figure a very interesting way, I think it's in 1455, of overcoming that problem. They put their soldiers on boats, gigantic boats. They sail around, and they get to the first spike strip. And they decide to not go over the spike strip because just with your car, if you run over the spike strip, it will put a hole in your boat. And what happens to boats that have holes? They sink. So you don't want to try to just ram the thing and get through. That's a suicide mission. So instead, they land their boat up there where the 22 April is on the land. They get out of their boats. They drag their boat out of the water and pick it up and move it over the land and put it back in the water over here where it says Golden Horn. So it was a pretty innovative kind of strategy. The leaders at Constantinople didn't think that was possible. These are massive boats. So it took a huge amount of manpower to drag the boats across the land, put them back in the water. Then they just sailed across and landed behind the walls, and it was over. So the Ottoman Empire does conquer Constantinople, and I think it's 1455. And what is seen as the last kind of bastion of defense for Europe falls.
Do you know how long it took them to carry the boat?
I'd have to look it up. It's not just one boat, it's a whole army of them. So I imagine a few weeks. But again, I have to look it up.
What year?
I believe it's 1455. But I'm not a big person for exact dates often either, so that's why I like having textbooks. I'm much more interested in the conflict of ideas rather than exactly this thing happened on this day. So the Muslim armies conquered the city, took control of it, and even made it their new capital city because it was so hard to conquer in the first place. The thing was a fortress. So they renamed it Istanbul, and it became the capital city of the Ottoman government. And from there, going into the 1500s, they launched further invasions, not just into Europe, but they also go forth and they conquer the Eastern Mediterranean. They conquer down into Baghdad. They go across North Africa and down into the Arabian Peninsula to basically rebuild the old empire that had disintegrated before. So by about the mid-1500s or so, that project is almost complete. And they feel powerful enough to start their invasions of Europe again. And they start invading from southeastern Europe and attacking to the northwest. And they very often get to the city of Vienna, which is another major European city, home of the Austrian Empire, the capital city of the Austrian state. So the Austrian government becomes the new kind of big defender of Europe. And a lot of Europeans say, well, if Vienna falls, then that just opens the door to the rest of Europe being invaded. And the Europeans are afraid of not just losing their land and their governments going out of existence, but they think that the Muslims will invade and wipe out Christianity from the face of the earth or something, which is probably false, but that's what the Europeans believe, probably to motivate themselves to keep fighting. But those wars go on for several hundred years back and forth. The Muslim armies conquer large chunks of southeastern Europe, and then the Europeans fight them back, and it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. One of the major dividing lines is the Danube River, which runs kind of to the northeast and southwest, close to Vienna. So that's often a kind of marking line. And the Ottomans often siege Vienna. You can see this one's in the 1500s, but it's not the last of them. Siege is a military term for, instead of directly invading a city and trying to take full control of it, you surround the city and wait for the enemy to either surrender or starve to death. So that's what siege warfare means. And the Ottomans laid siege to Vienna repeatedly for hundreds of years. And sometimes the siege of Vienna could last 5, 6, 7 years. They even tried naval invasions every once in a while. One of the big battles of the 1500s between the Ottoman invasion and a kind of combined force of Spanish and Austrians and other Europeans is at the Battle of Lepanto, which is down in Greece. And that's a big, especially Spanish victory that was very celebrated. And it's a old style. Someone had their cell phone and clicked a picture of the battle going on. But no, this is an artist's interpretation of the battle. One of the last times that the Ottomans are successful in conquering new land is in a war in the late 1600s, where they again tried to take Vienna and again failed. And that led to a treaty called the Treaty of Carlitz in 1699. And that was the last time that the Ottomans really threatened mainland Europe. After that, the scales have changed. The Europeans are now becoming technologically advanced, and they're using it militarily to attack. So after Karlitz in 1699, you generally get the European armies pushing the Ottomans out of southeastern Europe, piece by piece by piece, and that's a process that takes hundreds of years. So the Ottomans are on the attack. They're gaining more land generally in the 15 and 1600s, and then in the 17 and 1800s, the Ottomans are being pushed back. Question? No? So the Treaty of Carlitz in 1699 is a big type of turning point that historians recognize. Okay, and in order to accomplish this, the Europeans start making alliances with a lot of southeastern European landowners, and people have built castles and whatnot to help in fighting against the Ottoman invasion. And one guy down near Budapest named Vlad Tepes was one of just many regional heroes who led European armies, often identified as Christian armies, to fight against the Ottoman foreign invasion. So he was a celebrated figure, and also a very scary figure, because when he took captives, the rumors and the stories are that he enjoyed torturing them to death by putting them up on spikes or some kind of horrible thing. And there are stories that he even sat there and ate dinner while watching these people, slide down a spike strip or something in a very painful death, and that he enjoyed it for some reason. And they eventually start saying that he loves the sight of blood, and that's where you start getting the Dracula story coming out of. We think that he was we know he is an actual person, but we think that's where the legend started to come from, that there's this really creepy guy who has his castle way up on the hill and he enjoys torturing people, and eventually it's like ideas he gets addicted to blood and all these kinds of things. So a lot of local folklore that has gone in and created modern day horror stories and myths and all this kind of stuff. A lot of that comes out of the real life experiences, political and military, of different regions of the world. So that's just one of many. Okay, how is it that the Ottomans are so powerful in doing all these things? What is their system for control and power? How do they empower themselves so much that they can attack Europe and can think that they can conquer the whole European continent? Number one, they were administrative geniuses in a lot of ways, especially in the early part of their rule, especially up until about the 1600s. One of the problems for empires, when you conquer a foreign land, how do you convince foreigners to accept your conquest? How do you convince them to accept being ruled by a foreign entity now, or an occupying force?
You put in a puppet government that looks like someone that should.
Yeah, and that's one of the solutions that governments going all the way back in the ancient history have come up with. You don't take people from Arabia and send them in to rule India. Why? Because that's very offensive to Indians. Because they can see, just looking at the name and the history of their leader, that they are an occupied people, and it tends to piss them off. So you don't want to take a person from, say, Kansas and put them in charge of Egypt. That's not going to work. The Egyptian people want their own leadership, if only symbolically. So one thing that the Ottomans often did was to promote leaders from certain regions. When they conquered Egypt, they promoted native Egyptians to be the rulers over that territory. They were told that they had to follow orders from Istanbul. But these provincial leaders that they called the Beys were the leaders in tax collection and bridge building and raising and equipping armies. So they were the government functionaries. They were the bureaucracy, the government bureaucracy in the regions. One of the problems with promoting Egyptians to oversee Egypt is that a lot of Egyptians want Egypt to become independent again. So you have to watch a lot of those local leaders very closely. So there were spy networks that were sent in to provincial governments, regional governments, to watch those leaders and make sure they're not stealing from the treasury or forming alliances with other groups to promote revolution at some point. So it's a very delicate balancing act between giving some amount of local authority and having to watch that local authority so they don't try to proclaim independence. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's always an iffy thing. But the Sultan, the leader of the Ottoman state, basically the king of the Ottoman Empire, hired people to basically be his eyes and ears in all the provincial towns and governments. Another thing the Ottoman leaders did, especially early on, was to accept conversions, people that wanted to convert to Islam, which was basically the official state religion. They welcomed that, and they even promoted it. Muslims paid lower tax rates than any other religious group within the empire. So there's an economic incentive to convert. And also, Christians, especially that converted to Islam, could also become military leaders. So there's a kind of job promotion opportunity if you want to be in the military. And these people were called the Janissaries. And they are often directly controlled by the Sultan. So the Sultan has his people as the high military leaders, watching out for the Sultan's interests. And they're very dedicated to the Sultan instead of to the provincial government. The Ottoman Empire was also into the idea of education. They wanted to educate as many people as possible because they realized that intelligent and talented people come from all backgrounds in life and from all over the world. So they opened up education, at least low-level education, in all of their provinces. And say like a third grade student, whoever does best on the reading scores can be promoted to the next level. So by the time you get to really what we would think of today as high school and college age, those were the kind of smartest or those that could adapt easiest to new education systems. The highest educated were not just the rich. Which means that the highest educated usually go into government service because it's a constant job. They go into the bureaucracy. So you usually have the most talented or the hardest working people that go and work for the government one way or another. Therefore, the government is fairly efficient. Does that make sense? Whereas in Europe, a lot of government positions were sold to wealthy families who just wanted to give their kid a role in the government. So if you're the, say, son of a wealthy French landowner, you don't have to be all that good at anything because you know you're going to be taken care of. So just like a lot of rich kids in college today, they just don't work that hard because they know their family's rich and they're not going to have to keep a job for the rest of their life. They're going to be taken care of. So they kind of slack off. They don't try as hard as others. And what happens if you take those kind of spoiled rich kids and put them in charge of government? Yeah, it falls apart. What happens when you take a person who hadn't really studied math all that hard, you make them the head bridge builder for a city? What's going to happen to those bridges? They're going to collapse. So Europeans had that epidemic problem of government insolvency and inefficiency. Whereas in the Ottoman government, promotion was based on merit, how good you were at your job. So their government was far more efficient. Yeah?
Why did it take so long for Europe to get rid of that system?
Corruption. Just basic corruption.
Because everybody was more concerned with keeping the rich in power than...
Well, the rich are concerned with keeping the rich in power. And when you have the rich running things and everybody else is suffering, are the rich going to respond to the suffering?
Okay.
No, because the rich aren't suffering.
Yeah.
To them, the system's working exactly as it should. And I look around the United States today. Who's running the U.S. government? It's mostly rich people. Even though 1 out of every 6 Americans doesn't have enough food to eat every day. And they're even talking about cutting food aid to poor people. So, there you go. But that's why it doesn't change for so long. Because the corrupt forces are the ones making decisions. And usually at the point of a gun. And these are kings, these are monarchies, military dictatorships. So, let's see. Another major strength of the Ottoman state was that they tolerated non-Muslims. You didn't have to be a Muslim to live in this place. Christians and Jews and old Zoroastrians, if you've ever studied that, from ancient Persia, they were tolerated. They were not attacked by the government. They weren't thrown in jail. They didn't have their property confiscated or anything like that. They usually have to pay a little bit higher rate in taxes. But that's about it. They were tolerated. They were allowed to not just exist, but to openly worship their own religious ideas. Why do Muslims generally believe that? Because these other religions are also monotheistic. They believe in one creator God, right? Christianity believes in one God. So does Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and many others. So often the Muslim interpretation is that they're a little bit off in their beliefs, but they believe in the one God and they're worshiping the one God, so that's close enough for us. So who do the Muslims really not like? Yeah, polytheists, people who worship the gods of nature. The gods of the hurricane, the gods of the floods, the god of the sun, all that kind of stuff. So the Muslim governments are often not tolerant at all of polytheists. But the very fact that they're willing to tolerate other monotheisms means that Christians and Jews and other people did not pack up all their wealth and their education and move to some other part of the world. They were willing to be a part of the system. Whereas, especially in Europe at that time, if you weren't Christian and avowedly Christian, this is the time of the, what are they called?
Inquisition?
Yeah, the Inquisitions. Which are basically church investigations into who's not going to church. And if you're not a fully dedicated Christian, you could be burned alive. Or boiled alive. Or all kinds of horrible things. Or tortured for a few months or even years. And the major thing that made the Ottoman state militarily powerful is they adapted gunpowder technology. They were the first to build the large, powerful cannons and rifles. So they had what historians call the gunpowder armies. And when they attacked Europeans that were still running around on horses with swords, guess who wins those wars? You have one group running around with swords and bows and arrows, and the other group shooting bullets and cannonballs. Who do you think wins? Yeah, the more powerful army. So the Ottoman army hits harder when it attacks, and therefore is very militarily successful into the late 1600s because they had the best technology. And when the Europeans start adapting that technology in the 16 and 1700s, that's when the Europeans can more adequately defend themselves. Does all that make sense? Okay. The Ottomans go into a steep decline after the 1700s for many different reasons, but we'll talk about a few of them just real quick. Number one, a lot of their North African provinces start declaring independence or start revolutionary movements against the central government, mostly led by Egypt. Egypt is always the major trouble spot for the empire, for the Muslim empires going all the way back to the 600s. The Egyptians seem very dedicated to their own independence and not being ruled by a foreign group. The Treaty of Carlitz is the big turning point in the invasions of Europe. That's where the Ottomans start getting forced back out of Europe. So we've talked about that already. And corruption starts getting into the government. Instead of the promotion based on merit, you start getting families who get their children in positions, and those positions start getting inherited, especially in the provinces. So your education and wealth and government position was more increasingly decided by what family you're born into, rather than how good of a student or how hard of a worker you are. And over time, government gets a little bit worse, and a little bit worse, and a little bit worse, and a little bit worse, until by the late 1800s, the government doesn't seem to be able to solve any problems. And as you get the rise of very powerful families and factions within the governments, the factions start fighting each other, almost like political parties, where they try to knock out their enemies to protect their own wealth and position for themselves. So a lot of government leaders and bureaucrats become more interested in defending their own turf and their own power than actually promoting reasonable, good government policies that would solve social problems. Does that sound familiar at all? Politicians that were more interested in keeping their own position than serving their people. And not only are they not functioning well, but they become so corrupt that they start embezzling. They start taking tax money for themselves or giving it out to their friends. And therefore, government's so inefficient that it's running badly and it's running out of money at the same time. So what do? They raise taxes. So taxes go higher and higher, but the money's not being spent very well at all still, so it's largely seen as a waste, which is a big government debate today. And a lot of these families became so wealthy and powerful that they start buying up large houses, extravagant clothes, and having extravagant parties, what we today call conspicuous consumption, which is generally something that people do when they get rich. They like to show off their wealth. They like to make other people jealous. So what do people do today? Well, I don't know if they still do it today, but they used to, maybe 10 years ago, go off and buy Hummers, right? They used to go off and buy this stupidly extravagant car that gets like 6 miles a gallon. Why? For no other purpose than to show off, I am so rich, I can buy this piece of crap car that gets 6 miles a gallon. I can pay for the gas. You know, especially in Los Angeles. You don't need a Hummer in Los Angeles, right? You can take a paved road from the mountains to the beach, to the desert. Paved road anywhere you want to go. You don't need an off-road vehicle. But that's what wealthy people often do. They buy pointless things to show off their wealth. We call this conspicuous consumption. And as they buy more stuff, prices go up. So you get a kind of inflation. And another major problem they faced was that the royal ascendancy, the Sultan, usually, just like any other monarchy, the eldest son becomes the next king. That became debatable, especially in the 1700s and 1800s. You start getting these large families that go to war sometimes against each other to decide who the next king is going to be. So sometimes brothers attack each other and even kill each other to become the next king. So the long-term problem of that is when you have a king who has many sons, usually one son is designated the crown prince, which means the inheritor. And the rest of the sons, because that guy is so worried about the rest of his brothers becoming powerful, he keeps them out of government. Sometimes even imprisons them. Sometimes even has them executed. But if they're languishing in prison their whole adult lives, or under house arrest or something, they're not allowed into government. So if something happens to the brother who eventually becomes king, and one of these other brothers becomes king, they have no experience in any kind of responsibility. So now you have a king who is untrained, doesn't know what to do, and the government problems grow. So eventually, over time, government power goes to the harem, which is kind of the king's household, kind of chief of staff that run the king's meetings, and also the Grand Vizier, which becomes like a kind of prime minister. So government decision making starts getting split down through the years, which becomes problematic. So a question about any of those problems?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Going back to the religious.
Yeah.
About them tolerating. What religion was Egypt then? Because didn't they believe in sun and birds?
They had up until the point where Islam entered Egypt. So even by this point, Egypt was a Muslim-dominated society.
So nothing
Yeah.
changed,
Yeah. That's usually the story at the areas that the Muslims conquer. They bring Islam to it. And Islam is such a new idea to a lot of people. It's exciting. They convert to it. So even right down to today, Egypt has a Muslim majority. And very few Egyptians actually practice the ancient Egyptian religion. They're kind of celebrations and whatnot for different kinds of gods, but it doesn't seem that they're really dedicated to those gods. Other questions? No. So the history of ancient India was extraordinarily complex. India already had a gigantic population and its own kind of territory. The Indian subcontinent is largely cut off from the rest of Asia by the Himalayan mountains and the Hindu Kush mountains going into what is today Afghanistan. So the Indian subcontinent was its own territory for a long time and was ruled by native Indian groups. Had been invaded every once in a while, especially by Muslim empires around the 900s and 1000s. Those invasions for the long term were unsuccessful. Basically the Muslim armies would invade, especially kind of northwestern India, what is today Pakistan, and they would conquer the area and try to occupy it and hold it territorially for a while, but every couple decades or so an Indian revolutionary movement broke out to kick out the conquerors. So that went back and forth for many hundreds of years. In the early 1500s, one group came down from what is today Afghanistan out of the mountains and invaded northern India and conquered a large part of it. This is the invasions led by a guy named Babur. So he conquered only northern India, did not get to southern India so much. This central India is called the Deccan Plateau, which is a giant desert, so it's very difficult to get ancient armies through there to conquer the entire south part of the subcontinent also. So that was a long-term struggle. Eventually, after Babur died in 1540, an Indian revolutionary movement broke out against his conquerors, his armies, and kicked them back out. In the 1540s, I think early 1550s, another invasion from Babur's family came in and took over northern India again. So again, it's going back and forth over several decades. The guy who inherits this is named Akbar, and he becomes known Akbar the Great. He rules over northern India, and later on in his reign, through the late 1500s, launches army invasions down through the deserts and conquers large parts of the south. So Akbar's big contribution to history is to unite a whole lot of divergent Indian territories that hadn't been, quote, united for a long time. And in history, when we use the word unite, it usually means some kind of conquest or bribery or some type of underhanded or cutthroat type of process. It's not so much Everyone just follow me and everyone agrees. It is questionable whether his government over almost the entire subcontinent had really control over the whole landmass. Historians have studied this, and a lot of historians argue that it looks like it's more of an imperial government where the government sits up in the capital city in the north, and the major landowners of the rest of the territory proclaim their allegiance to the central king, but in reality they actually run their own territories however they want. So it seems to be a kind of empire in name only and not in a real kind of daily government type of function. Does that make sense? To put it simply, Akbar probably did not have hands-on control over the whole thing completely. He had to rely on regional leaders, and he couldn't always force them to do what he wanted. But Akbar's reign is fairly stable into the early 1600s. He died in 1605. And the history of the 1600s in India is one of increasingly corrupt and inefficient government. His inheritors basically take over, and they run the place a little bit worse on a yearly basis. So government gets a little bit worse, a little more corrupt, a little more untrustworthy down through the 1600s. The governors of India seem to be much more interested in living a nice lavish lifestyle themselves than actually running the government for the benefit of the people, say building major roads or anything like this. So government infrastructure tends to get worse and worse and worse, even as they're raising tax rates, because they're corrupt. They raise taxes on people to pay for what they want personally rather than benefit for the overall country. For example, this is the era where the Taj Mahal is built, which took a couple decades to build. A huge amount of workforce and therefore a huge amount of money being spent. So they had to raise taxes to build the thing. And did the Indian people actually benefit from this is questionable. 1600s is also known as a time when the Europeans finally make it to India, especially the Portuguese in the kind of late 1500s, start getting to the Indian market, so you get an international kind of intervention in India in a way that hadn't been done in a long time. The Portuguese go in first in the 1500s and start making contact with Indian markets and basically buying and selling things. The Portuguese, though, never tried to take direct control over India because they seem to have felt that the territory is far too large and there's just too many Indian people to try to conquer. The English are much more interested in that. So in the 1600s, the English come into the Indian markets and over time force the Portuguese out. And the English basically take India as a type of colony. They start making deals with regional leaders and even the Mughal leaders themselves. So over time, the Mughal Empire that ruled over India was basically an employee of the English Empire. Does that make sense? They were following orders from the English because the English went in with the 16 and 1700s with cannons and big guns and big armies. And the native Indians didn't have the advanced technology to defend their own territory. So over time, the English gradually take over, not just economically, but also politically. The biggest piece of English power in India became known as the British East India Company. The English government sold monopoly rights to one company to run all trade between England and India. So that company became extraordinarily wealthy. If you wanted to buy something in England that was imported from India, you had to go through that company. And what happens when there's only one company selling something? What do they do to the prices? They jack them up as high as they possibly can because their goal is to make money. So this company is hugely profitable in the especially the 1700s. They're so profitable that they build up their own army, their company army. So it becomes a military system also. So eventually, the East India Company rules India as basically its own private little kingdom. The English armies aren't all that involved for the most part. They start to withdraw because the company can pay for its own military. So English power in India, and as that becomes profitable, the company tries to expand beyond and go to other places, especially China, which we'll talk about later. Their power was centralized in the company in a lot of different ways. So the company was even running English diplomacy in India, making international contracts and treaties. So that shows an extreme level of power by a private company. The Indians don't really like this so much, so the English over time have some problems keeping control. Every once in a while the Indians start talking about rising up and revolting, trying to kick out the foreigners again. This especially starts happening by the mid-1700s and coincides with a European war between Britain and France called the 7 Years' War. So the French in the 1750s tried to also push their way into India. So India became one of the worldwide sites of a European war between the British and the French. And the British were the big winners of it. At the Battle of Plassey in 57, the British defeat a combined force of native Indians and French. And at that point, the British take full control and declare India to be a complete colony. And from that point forward, until the end of World War II, England, the British government, they run India. They call it their own territory, like it's a part of their own country. So, questions about any of this at all? No.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You said that the English company was privately owned.
Yep. It's a stock company. You could buy stock in it if you wanted. So, it'd be like one of these Wall Street kind of companies that you could invest in. Yeah. And some of the biggest investors were actually members of the British government. So this would be like members of the U.S. Congress getting involved in a company that's going off and colonizing like Afghanistan or something. So there's obvious corruption here. Because if the company gets in trouble, what do? They ask for a government bailout. And because the people voting on the law to give the bailout are shareholders in the company that needs the bailout, guess what passes? Easily. The bailout law. Yeah.
How come the French lost? Did the Britain have more people or better weapons?
It's a very complex war. India is only one site of the war. This is also a war happening in the American colonies. In the United States, we call it the French and Indian War. So it's only one place that the French and the British were fighting against each other. They're also fighting against each other in Europe and in the Caribbean and in East Asia. So it appears that the French didn't make India a priority the way the British did in the war. That the French tried to rely on the native Indians themselves to build up a large enough army to defeat the British. Does that make sense? So the French went in and said to the Indians, if you kick the British out, then we will guarantee your independence and you can have a new country. You can have your old country back. Which, who knows if that would have actually happened, but it's hard to tell because the French lost and the British retained control. Does that make sense? All right. Other questions?